Hi guys, it's Mrs. Phillips. I want to talk to you today about convection. Back in the day, probably sixth grade, you might have hit on it in seventh grade. You guys talked about three different types of heat transfer: convection, radiation, and conduction. This year, we are only focusing on convection. You're going to hear about it and have to understand it for the unit that we are currently in, which is weather. But you are also going to need to know it for a future unit whenever we start talking about plate tectonics and geology. Okay, so it's really important to understand this now so you have a solid base. Right here, it's telling us that convection is a type of heat transfer. Okay, it occurs when you heat a liquid or a gas and the particles spread out and become less dense. This affects how they move. So if you look at the picture that I have here, I've got a box that has these blue little circles. Okay, these little circles are just particles in, some liquid or gas, it doesn't matter. But if you can tell, they're blue. And blue, generally, you think of cold. So I want you to think of blue as cold and red as warm. Okay? With these particles being cold, they are tightly packed together. They are dense. Okay? Now, if I add a heat source, right, if you look to the box on the right, there's a heat source there. And what happens now is we have heated up these particles, so I've turned them red, and instead of being densely packed together, they are now more wild and free, right? They are kind of going everywhere. There's a lot more space between them, okay? And this space lets these cold, dense particles fall through, okay? That is telling us that heat is going to rise as the cold falls through it and then sinks. Okay? If you look at this diagram right here where it says warm air rises, right? The air gets warm and it rises. We have a heat source down here, the ground. Okay, the ground is generally pretty warm. It's going to heat up the air around it, and that air is going to rise. And you can see that because it's the red arrows and they are going up. Okay, now there is no heat source at the top, right? You don't see a heat source up there. And so what's happening is as that warm air rises, it's moving away from your heat source. So if you're away from the heat source, you're going to start to cool down. Whenever these particles cool down, they're going to come back together. They're going to be more dense. And so they're going to begin to fall down. Okay. But once it falls down, right, once it sinks, it is coming back down to the heat source, which means it's going to start all over. So if you see, these are arrows kind of running in a cycle. It's non-stop. It's going to fall down, it's going to heat up, and then it's going to rise, it's going to cool, it's going to fall, it's going to heat up, and then rise. It just keeps going and going. Okay? Now, the main point here is cold air sinks, warm air rises. Okay? And the last thing really that I wanted to talk to you about is what is Earth's heat source? It is the sun. Okay? The sun heats up the Earth, okay, which the Earth then transforms it into heat energy, which heats up the lower atmosphere, which is what we will be learning about in weather.